All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Marketing Management and Money. I am your host, Ryan Owens.
And I'm your host, Ryan Murray.
We welcome you to yet another episode where we are going to be talking about financial strategies for your small business and how to weather the storms that come your way in small business. And as we go about, operating in this wonderful world that we live in, there are a lot of things that we try to control and we do really well at, and that's how we make money as small businesses. But there are still so many things that come our way that come out of left field and smack us upside the head that we had no idea was coming, right? Yeah. Like there are things that we just can't see coming. And so what do we do? And as small businesses, how do we even begin to, wrap our hands around
everything?
Yeah.
I mean,
all of that, grabbing the whole bull by the horns.
2020 was a wild ride.
It was a beep.
As we're coming to the end of 2020, I hear all these people are like, oh, well, good thing that we're almost done with 2020. And I'm like, guess what?
Yeah.
2021 is still there.
New Year's hits. It's not all changing. Right. Sorry.
You can put whatever date you want.
If that's a news flash to you, I am so sorry that I had to be the one to break that news to you.
And a lot of times, we've had a couple episodes where we've talked about being resilient as an entrepreneur. We've talked about looking for opportunity in catastrophe, because there are opportunities in catastrophe. And we've talked about various aspects of kind of weathering the storm. But today in specific, we want to talk about this idea of cash flow, because everyone knows that cash is king, but a lot of times that's sort of cliche. Like, what does that even mean? It's like, oh, yeah. Cash is king. Oh, I've got cash flow. I'm like, well, do you have enough? Do you need more? Do you have too much? And a lot of times people are like,
I'm just hoarding my cash. How can I have too much?
Right.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, cash is a tool, and you got to understand how to use that cash.
Yeah. A carpenter doesn't need 17 hammers.
Oh, thank you for just spelling it out plain right up front, because everyone's like, oh, more cash is better.
No.
Carrying around all those hammers is just heavy and awkward.
Yeah. And you're wasting your money on hammers at that point.
And so,
there's some like super specialized carpenter out there that's like, but I need these to do my job. And we're just like slamming.
No.
I don't know.
No, this is what happened. There's a couple that's listening to the podcast, and the wife just smacked the husband and said, I told you to get rid of those.
Yeah, exactly. Not everything's a nail, honey. Just kidding. No, but I feel like I love this topic. I honestly really enjoy this topic, because we have talked about, as an entrepreneur, it takes guts. It takes grit. Like, you have to be a special kind of a breed to be able to weather a lot of these storms. Mm-hmm. And it takes a special intuition a lot of times to be able to make the right decisions when there is no clear answer, when there is no accurate information or, relevant documentation or whatever. There's a bunch of unknowns. It takes a lot of that intuition, but it also takes a high level of intelligence, right? And most entrepreneurs don't get credit for that.
Well, the thing that I want to talk about specifically is when you get into cash flow, if you are not using that high level of intelligence, and if you're not calculating your targeted cash balance and going off of intuition, that is a mistake. So right off the bat, I'm just going to throw it out there that you need to know how to calculate your targeted cash balance. Now, what I mean by targeted cash balance is every company, they have this cushion that they need to have. And it's that cushion that they want to keep in their business to make sure that, they're not running too hot, they're not running too cold. That's why it's targeted. And it's a calculation. It's not an overly complicated calculation. And we're going to touch on it in this episode. But I'm also going to put a shameless plug out there, because this all comes from our online training, Growth by the Numbers. Now, we put out just a few weeks ago that we're doing a shameless plug for Growth by the Numbers for our podcast listeners. You can get it on sale for 30 days, and it's going to be $99. That's $200 off the regular price.
$97.
Close enough.
Under $100.
Do I hear 96?
Yeah, right. Going once, going twice. 47. Sold.
We want to put that out to our podcast listeners, but what we're going to do is we're going to cover some of the concepts that are in that training in this podcast episode to give you a little bit of a flavor of what we're talking about, why we're so passionate about this, and why, with a week left, I'm going to kind of just be a little bit sales pitchy here and say, yeah, you need to jump on this, you know?
Right.
So,
though I don't think that that's how auctioneering works. Just saying.
Oh, does it go
down?
Anyway,
well, no. So while you were talking, I had this analogy come to mind. So we talked about like carpenters using hammers, right?
Mm-hmm.
If an entrepreneur's grit is like a hammer, then these skills and everything in terms of being able to manage your finances correctly is like the tape measure.
Oh,
they serve different purposes, yet they're both incredibly vital to the success of that carpenter, right? Same thing with entrepreneurs. You have to be able to have that intuition, that grit, and that wherewithal, right? But you also have to be able to, like we said, you have that high level of intelligence, but be able to use it, be able to apply it to, especially when it comes to managing the finances and making decisions around your small business decisions and financials, right? Your finances.
And I know we're deviating a little bit here for a second, but I'm going to deviate.
I used a tape measure because it has numbers.
I know, it was beautiful. But it really is important what you said, and that is that not everything in business is intuition. Not everything is grit. You can't just, you can't bulldoze your way into every scenario.
Yeah, you can't muscle a balance sheet.
And there are entrepreneurs out there that they're just gonna plow through it, and they're just like, I'm dedicated. I'll make it happen. I don't care what it takes. And I'm just like, you know what, admirable, but
probably burning a lot of unnecessary bridges.
Right. And so that's not necessarily the best approach. There's also this issue of, like, okay, we're just going to go in and I'm going to trust my gut. And I'm like, well, is it inspiration or indigestion? You've got one of the two going on.
Got to be careful.
And if
things change as you get older.
if you're making mistakes constantly, sure, you might be recovering from those mistakes, but picture like when you're watching, an awesome soccer game, and the team you're rooting for, they just keep making mistakes time and time again. And sure, it might be scored up at zeros, but when the ball is always on the wrong side of the field, it's only a matter of time. If the opposing team has already shot a dozen times and your team has never taken a shot because they can't get in position, like, stop making the mistakes.
And your team is the one that's sweating. The opposition is like, hey, we got at least another couple dozen shots in us before you even start to sweat.
Right. And, you can make a couple mistakes and recover, but you can't live by mistakes. And when it comes to finance, it's all calculations. You can know it. You can understand it.
Right. Anybody can, right?
Right.
I mean, we talk about this high level of intelligence, and I feel like there are probably a lot of people out there that are like, whoa. I mean, I'm an entrepreneur, but I'm not that smart. Like, don't change yourself, right? These are things that you have to have your wits about you, right? As long as you're an entrepreneur that's at least somewhat successful, I think it's fairly easy to see, especially to those around you, that you have that wherewithal, you have that intelligence to be able to grasp these concepts. I'm not a numbers guy. I'm not a finance guy. These numbers or these concepts are not that difficult to grasp.
I mean, if you can understand them.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. I wasn't going to go there because, self-deprecation and all. But thank you for demeaning me in such a way that our listeners could benefit. Yeah, it's great.
On the behalf of our listeners, because I care about our listeners.
Yeah. I'll sacrifice myself for our listeners any day of the week.
So,
but it's like a lot of these concepts have names that you've never heard of or things that sound complicated and whatever. And it's like, you get past that and it's easy.
Yeah.
It's really easy. These aren't difficult things. And that's what, again, shameless plug, I love about the Growth by the Numbers training is that it keeps it in that realm. It gives you the relevant tools. It gives you the hammer. It gives you the tape measure. It gives you the carpenter's pencil and the square. And it says, this is how you need to use these. Like a square is to draw a straight line. We're not going to get any more complicated than that.
Right.
And if you don't know what a carpenter's square is, it's like, oh man, scary. No, it's not. Right. Same thing is with these small business financials. You know, there may be some terms in there that you're like, whoa, I don't know what that is. It's a little bit scary. It's really not. So you just take it, you learn how to draw that straight line. You're like, oh, it's just for a straight line. Yeah, it's just for a straight line.
I'm going to do one little capstone to that shameless plug.
Okay.
And then I'm going to share with everyone the calculation for the
We're now
targeted
offering
cash
it for
balance.
$94.
No. But if you want it, all you have to do is you shoot an email to ryan@marketingmanagementmoney.com and just put in the email, say, I want the podcast discount. You know, let us know.
And you've only got a week left.
You've got 1 week left. You shoot us an email.
Better get on it.
And, you know, we'll hook you up. $200 off. Like, super easy.
And that's only for our podcast listeners. We're, again, like we said, back when we first introduced this, we are not promoting this anywhere else.
Okay, so with that, let's get into this targeted cash balance, because this is one of the things that's covered in that training. Super easy. We go into detail in the training because we have the numbers in front of us. It's really hard in a podcast to put all the numbers, so I'm just going to talk conceptually here, but it's not that hard. As you've been talking about with the analogy of the carpenter, it's not that hard to figure out what's going on.
I'm gonna pause you.
Dude, the suspense is killing everyone.
I know. Everybody's like, come on, man, enough.
Just give me the calculation.
No, I'm going to prove my point here. This is beautiful. This is case in point right here. So we're going to talk about things like the working capital cycle. Have you guys ever heard of that? Maybe, maybe not. Do you have any idea what the definition for that? No, maybe not. I don't know. The other thing, we're going to talk about your targeted cash balance. Well, it's like, well, targeted cash balance, you know, common sense says, but am I right? You know? So there are a few terms right there, right out of the gate that you may or may not know.
Right.
And these are key financial terms.
Yep.
Right.
You learn them once, you always have them.
And they're simple.
Yes.
If my Neanderthal neocortex can decipher.
I wasn't going to go that far.
You guys are going to be okay. That's what I'm saying. Let's rip.
So targeted cash balance, you really need two items in order to calculate the targeted cash balance. One is you need to know how long you want to have a cash balance for. How many days specifically is what we're talking about here. And so if I'm looking at this targeted cash balance and I'm saying, okay, in the targeted cash balance, I want to have cash flow for 30 days, then you just need to know what 1 day of cash is worth in your business. If it's 60 days,
yeah,
you know,
times 30, times 60, whatever. And where do you come up with that number?
Okay.
Right?
So one of the tools that you talked about is the working capital cycle, and that is a way to calculate how many days. There are other ways to go about it. You can look at how many, the length of terms that you give. So if you offer credit, you can look at that. Usually you're looking at receivables, you're looking at inventory, you're calculating the days on that. You're subtracting out the payable portion. These are the things that are affecting the cash flow. So what we're talking about here is we're talking about the current asset portion of the balance sheet. And so if you're not familiar with the current asset portion of the balance sheet, then that is specifically where you want to go. You want to look at that and you want to say, okay, what do I need to manage my current portion? Again, there's one of those terms where you're just like, current portion? Is that like my helping of soup that I get right now?
More noodles, please.
So the terminology here is we're just talking about what are the things that are going to turn over quickly within a year is the definition of current. And so, my accounts receivables, my inventory, my cash, my payables, these are the things that we're really looking at to kind of do this calculation. And so what I do is I will calculate how many days of cash that I need. Now, I'm going to give you a little shortcut here on a podcast, because if you want to know how to do it correctly, you really need to run through the training and learn how to do it with the numbers, because that's the correct way to do it. And I'm not going to try and, throw out so much gobbledygook numbers that everyone's going to be like, I'm completely lost. So I'm going to give a little bit of a shortcut here, and that is start with at least 30 days. Start with 1 month. and go from there. So, you can start with 1 month. You could build it up to 2 months. Just go a month at a time. Now, it's better to get a tighter calculation, but, a month's worth of cash flow is a great thing to do.
Better than nothing.
Better than nothing. So there's your step right there. We're like, oh, okay, we're going to go with 1 month's worth of cash flow. Now, how do we get to that 1 month's worth of cash flow? That's super easy. So you're going to do a combination of your P&L, profit and loss, and the balance sheet. Again, this is all spelled out. If you want to see, examples of this, that's what the training is for. But if you're already familiar with it, so on the profit and loss, you're just looking at your cash-related expenses, the expenses that are going to require you to pay cash for. Operating expenses essentially is what we're looking at here.
Yeah.
On the balance sheet side of things, we're going to take our current liabilities. So I'm looking at my operating expenses, I'm looking at my current liabilities. I'm adding those two together, and that right there is telling me, okay, this is what I need to go through. Make sure that you're looking at it at a month's period of time. So if I've got, a full year's P&L, I'm going to divide it by 12 to come up with a month's
a nice average.
Right, a month's worth of cash. The same thing on the balance sheet side of things. I'm looking at that and I'm like, okay, I'm going to divide it by 12, come up with what I need to have for the month.
And in this scenario, for all intents and purposes, having that average is totally acceptable, perfectly okay, right? I mean, because if you look at the purpose of why you're doing this and what you're getting at, it's like you're just trying to have a cushion. You're just trying to have a cash cushion, right? You want to have a significant enough. You want to make sure that it's significant enough to cover, like we're talking about, your expenses and everything. And so you need to be able to look at some of those things. And if that's the quickest way to get, I mean, if you don't want to spend hours and hours and hours trying to collect data and parse through information and whatever, and that's a simple way that you can do it that way.
Yeah.
It's totally fine.
Yeah.
And if you deem that you need, well, actually, I probably need about 3 months. Well, still get your average, times it by 3. Done.
Yeah.
Easy peasy.
And so what I would do is I would take my operating expenses, I would take all of my current liabilities, I would add them together, I would divide it by 12, and there I've got approximately 30 days.
Yep.
Now, the actual calculation with the numbers, sure, it's going to get you closer. But right there, and this is the interesting thing. So I've helped a lot of businesses manage their cash flow. And I've seen some pretty complicated cash flow forecasting tools. I've seen some pretty crazy things where people are like, oh, yeah, I've got this and this, and they're pulling in everything.
Yeah.
I've seen people that are just like, if I've got money in the bank, it means I have cash.
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, well, that's probably...
It's a good start.
We can get a little bit more sophisticated than that. There's a balance between the two.
But it also doesn't need to be the other end of the spectrum, like you were saying. It doesn't need to be this crazy, we're pulling in matrices and doing all kinds of crazy calculations and whatever. You don't have to do that.
Yeah. And I find that it's so hard for people to hit it where they're supposed to hit it. So there are typically two camps that I see. Camp A is the people who they are severely underestimating their cash flow. Mm-hmm. And this tends to be any business that is rapidly growing, that is struggling, that is new, anything that's going through a lot of change, they tend to severely underestimate how much cash they really need. And they kind of are just, skirting by, trying to get lucky because they don't have that cushion. They don't have that level of cash to support them if something goes a little bit south. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of early startups fail is they just don't plan for cash.
And then they don't see it coming. And when they, it gets there, it's too late.
Yeah.
And they're done. Because you run out of cash, you're out of business.
Oh, shoot. I needed some cash.
Oh.
Yeah.
Uncle.
Yeah. Now, the other one, and this one in my mind is more fascinating, and that is the established business that holds too much cash. And I see this a lot. It tends to be established businesses that have been around for like 20, 30 years, something like that, especially if it's the original owner who is still running the business and they're being very successful. They tend to get less aggressive the older that they get. It's this natural tendency that, young kids are
Maturity sets in, and
yeah, you gain some wisdom, but you also lose some of that aggressive edge. And so you've got these entrepreneurs that they've been at it for 20, 30 years, and they start to get pretty conservative. Well, the interesting thing that happens is you're like, well, isn't that good that they're holding on to all that cash? I'm like, personally, like in their own personal portfolio, wonderful.
right.
But for the business, what happens is they lose their aggressive edge because
Yeah.
they're holding on to too much cash. They get soft. They lose this, competitiveness.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, this new company comes in, undercuts them, and they end up selling their business at a fraction of what they could have gotten, or they're not able to pass the business on. It fails in a second generation.
Yep.
And I see a lot of these things, and I'm like, it's actually a bad practice to just hoard cash, because you're going to lose your competitiveness because of that.
Yeah, we've talked about in the past. So again, I love cars, and we've talked about how when you build up a small business, you're building this like immaculate, beautiful custom car, right? And when you start to hoard cash, it's like you're driving this beautiful machine down the road. It sounds amazing. People are asking you all kinds of questions about it and gawking and all that. And all of a sudden you're in this race, you're in this rally, and you start to let off the gas. You know what I mean? Well, because I've taken a corner too sharply, or I didn't see something coming and I had to, whatever. And so you let off the gas and you drive slower. Now that's not always a bad thing, but in this instance,
sometimes it is.
Hoarding cash, it absolutely is. That's like being on a straightaway and be like, well, there might be something up there. No, lay into it. Go.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's the exact same thing in small business. You have to get to the point where you can separate your own personal risk tolerance from that of what your business is capable of doing.
Right. And so I want to cover one more piece on cash flow before we wrap up this episode. And that is this idea of, okay, the amount of cash I need today is not the same amount of cash that I needed yesterday or that I'll need tomorrow.
Yeah.
We started this episode by talking about uncertainty, talking about, the roller coaster of 2020. And if you're not holding more cash in 2020 than you were holding in 2019, either you know something that none of us know, or more likely you're making a mistake. You should be holding more cash today than you were holding a year ago. But
that might be kind of difficult though, right? Because as a small business, you go through 2020 and you're hit with all these things and you're like, well, business slowed down and I had to use some of my cash to pay payroll, or I had to keep the lights on with some of that cash. And it's like, yeah, that's why that's there, but you have to rebuild that. You have to make it a priority within your business to reevaluate what you need and rebuild.
So here's the piece that I really want to hone in on, and you're absolutely right, is, okay, so I got hit pretty hard. I'm trying to rebuild. It's tight, so it's hard for me to come up with excess cash in the first place. How much cash am I going for? How long should I scrimp and save, hold back on what I want to do so that I can build up my cash flow? How long should I do this? Well, without calculating it, without actually putting some numbers behind it, you're guessing.
Yep.
And if you're guessing, then you're always going to be at the disadvantage of someone who's calculating it.
Well, even just disadvantage, period, because you're either underestimating, which
puts you in a risky spot.
Yeah, the next tidal wave hits and you're toast.
Right.
Or you are, like we talked about, you're just completely letting off the throttle and you're not doing what you could be doing as a business.
Yeah.
This isn't you personally in your retirement fund. This is, what your business, the potential that your business has. And
Right.
you're letting all of that potential energy that could be kinetic energy remain as potential.
Potential
energy.
Potentially.
You could potentially be potential.
Yes.
Physics. Who knew?
Huh.
Physics and finance. Ooh, physics and finance.
But I really want to just end on this note, and that is, if you're not calculating your cash, you're making a mistake.
Yep.
Because it's not one of those, you don't guess on cash flow, you calculate cash flow. And when you do that calculation, it makes you more competitive. It makes you more stable and secure as a company. And it also gives you a peace of mind where you're just like, oh, hey, I actually know that I'm in good standing.
Yep.
You know?
Yeah. And that's worth so much.
So much. I can't tell you how many entrepreneurs I keep talking to that they're just nervous. They're nervous about everything that's going on. And I'm like, you know what? There are things you can do to make yourself less nervous, to understand your personal forecast for, you know, the next quarter or year or 5 years.
Yeah.
And all of that is a calculation. You can get it down to the penny if you want to.
Right.
You know, and so again, if you guys don't know how to do that calculation, we put together the Growth by the Numbers training. You can find it. It's on mastermind.com is where the training is going to be held. But if you email us, Ryan@marketingmanagementmoney.com, conveniently, since it's Ryan and Ryan, we'll both get it.
Yeah.
And that way we'll catch that you want the discount. You want to get this thing $200 off. And you are serious about learning the financials in your business.
Yeah. This is a game changer of business finance training. It will absolutely, completely innovate the way you do your financials and the way you run your business. It will turn you from that old, rusty, rundown 64 fastback that's rotting in some farmer's field into like a show-worthy fastback Mustang.
Yeah.
And if you don't like Mustangs, call it a Camaro. I don't care.
We've been doing this training for years. We've got hundreds of businesses that can vouch for the fact that it literally has changed their business.
Yeah.
It has saved.
Yeah.
I had one business. They went through the training. I sat down with them afterwards for about 30 minutes, saved them 10 grand plus right off the bat in something that they didn't realize. I'm like, why are you holding on to that? Oh, I didn't realize I was holding. Okay, you need to get rid of that. It saved them $10,000. Boom, like that. I'm like, well, you just paid for the training, and they were super happy. They're just like, okay, that piece alone was well worth it, but yet all the additional stuff, I'm like, yeah, like you can do this. It's easy. So anyway,
and the first time that cushion comes in use, that's such a great feeling, right?
To not go out of business,
yeah.
It does feel good.
Even if you wouldn't have gone out of business, just to not have to take that hit so hard, because we do as entrepreneurs, we get beat, right?
Yeah, and then I see people doing stuff like they're, taking out a second mortgage or they're racking up their credit cards, and I'm just like, you could have avoided all of that.
Yeah. Yep.
So,
anyway.
Yeah, don't just go at it with grit.
Use those smarts that we know you have.
Take the tape measure out.
Yeah.
And measure.
Exactly.
With that, thank you so much for joining us. We hope you'll tune in next week for another episode of Marketing Management and Money. And we hope to hear from you, Ryan at marketingmanagementmoney.com.
Thank you for listening.